Crime among white Americans was declining for years prior to the decade of the 1960s. But it was during the 1960s that crime rates began skyrocketing among both blacks and whites. And it was after the historic civil rights laws were passed that blacks began rioting in cities across the country.
Yes.
Again, this is just, well, actually, not only do you know it, but you relish, you relish how contrarian this is to everything we think we understand. What happens in the 1960s that leads to rioting?
For one thing, the justification of rioting, for one thing, and the holding back of the police. One of the biggest riots in terms of deaths occurred in Detroit. And the governor sent in troops, but he sent them with strict orders to hold off and so on. And once the rioters, who were just a small percentage of the population of the black community, once they saw that the police weren't going to do anything, they ran amok. I contrast that with Chicago, where I still remember the original Mayor Daley coming on television and saying, "I have instructed my police in case of riots to shoot to kill." There was horror across the country. People didn't notice that there were far fewer deaths in Chicago than there were in places where the mayor came on and pleaded with people to behave and said, "I understand your problems," and all of that kind of stuff, none of which stops riots.
Although Detroit, once again, economic facts and fallacies, although Detroit had the worst of the riots, the poverty rate among Detroit's black population was only half of that of blacks nationwide. Its home ownership rate among blacks was the highest in the country, and its unemployment rate was 3.4% lower than among whites nationwide. Detroit did not have a massive riot because it was an economic disaster area. It became an economic disaster area after the riots.
Yes.
So again, what causes these riots? Once they get started, the governor does the wrong thing.
Yes.
But what starts them?
Oh, anything can start a riot. The question is, how do you stop them? And James Q. Wilson once said, the only thing that will stop the riot is overwhelming force on the scene. But you see, if you put overwhelming force on the scene, that will indeed stop the riot cold. But then the next day, the newspapers will say, why did the police overreact? I mean, there was just a little disturbance, and here come these tons of cops.
Right. Here's once again, race and culture, economic facts and fallacies. Race is used as a sorting device for decision-making, even by people who are not racists. Thus, employers may be reluctant to hire young black males because these employers are aware of what a high proportion of them have been arrested or imprisoned, even if the employers have no antipathy to black people as such and readily hire older blacks or black females, close quote. Are you saying that discrimination, even on the basis of race, you're saying it can be rational. Mm-hmm. Do you want to suggest that it can be acceptable?
Well, that's a different question.
Yes,
but I do notice that among a group of employers who routinely check everyone for prison records, the hiring of young black males is greater than in the employers in general. Whereas once they realize...
If they find somebody whose record is clean, they'll take him.
Yes.
All right. Segment 2, race and economics. Economic facts and fallacies. Quote, few subjects produce more fallacies than race. Among these fallacies are that, now get ready, I'm going to give you a passage here. Race was the basis of slavery, that racism is the main reason for black-white differences in incomes, and in all the other aspects of life that depend on income. Moreover, there is often an implicit assumption that racism and discrimination are so closely linked that they go up or down together. Now, what you have produced is a handful of outrages, and we'll take them one at a time. How's that? Race wasn't the basis of slavery?
Oh, it's a simple historical matter. Slavery existed for thousands of years, as far back as there are any records of human beings. Archaeological finds suggest that slavery existed before human beings could read and write. So, a racial difference between the slaves and the enslavers, that is a relatively new phenomenon. You didn't have in ancient times the ability to go to another continent and move millions of people of a different race across the ocean. So you enslaved the people who were nearby. The Europeans enslaved Slavs for centuries before they brought the first black African to the Western Hemisphere.
Okay, but so you're not suggesting, you do not wish to say anything other than that slavery as practiced in the United States was, it may have been recent, but you'd be willing to grant that it was particularly perverse and destructive because race got mixed into it at that point, right?
Race got mixed into it in the United States more than anywhere else for a very simple reason. The United States was founded, as the Declaration said, of independence, said all men are created equal.
Right.
If that's true, then the only way you can justify slavery is to say that some men are less than men.
I see. So the racial
but in Brazil, where Brazil imported more slaves than the United States, there was no such ideology. Brazil was not a democratic country. The whole issue never arose.
I see. All right. Race doesn't account for differences in black-white income?
No, the differences between income between Western Europeans and Eastern Europeans is greater than the difference between blacks and whites in the United States. Differences in income are the rule, they are not the exception.
Thank you. Mr. Williams, when you advocate for the freedom to contract, would you extend that to the freedom to not hire someone on any basis whatsoever? And what I'm referring to specifically is the laws that prohibit someone from discriminating on the basis of all kinds of sex and race and religious.
Yes, I would. I mean, I believe that I mean, for example, in free speech, the true test of one's commitment to free speech does not come when you allow people to be free to say those things that you think they should say. It comes when you allow people to say those things that you find despicable. Similarly, with the freedom of association, the freedom of association does not come when you allow people to associate in ways that you think is right. The true test comes when you allow people to associate in ways that you find despicable. Now,
I mean, should people be able to associate in the Ku Klux Klan?
Yeah, if they want to, as long as they don't violate somebody else's property rights. I mean, if there's a private club, then I think that they have the right to say, well, Williams, we don't want you in. Or if there's however, in a public library where I pay taxes or anything else that's public, I think that, no, they don't have the right to discriminate by race. But in terms of whatever is privately owned, I think people have the right to, they should have the right to discriminate on any basis that they want. Now, that doesn't mean that I like it, but I respect their right. But on another point, if you ask the question down through our history, we had a lot of Jim Crow laws saying that restaurants could not serve blacks, or trolley car companies had to have blacks sit in the back, or many other regulations like this. And you say, well, look, whenever you see a law, your first suspicion is that that law is on the books, because not everybody would voluntarily obey, act according to the specification of the law. And so if white people would not serve blacks in a restaurant, why in the world would you need a law? And so the fact that there are many laws mandating discrimination suggests that many whites would not have been discriminated in certain ways. But again, to specifically answer your question, yes, I believe that in private matters that people have the right to discriminate. And just like, I mean, I wouldn't want anybody, back in 1960 when I married Mrs. Williams, I would not want anybody saying, look, you have to give white women an equal opportunity to marry you. I discriminated against all women, women that with criminal records, women that didn't bathe regularly, Italian women, Chinese women. I didn't give every woman an equal opportunity. I discriminated. And matter of fact, Mrs. Williams, she's bless her soul, she's departed now. She required that I continue to discriminate, even though on occasion, I wanted to offer equal opportunity.
I hate when that happens.
Tom, you saw the election of Barack Obama as a triumph of sheer vacuous hopefulness
Yes.
over seriousness and realism. Is that fair?
Yes.
All right. Since then, he's elected in November 2008. We've seen the emergence of the Tea Party, the recapturing of the House of Representatives by a large Republican majority. Just days ago, Congressman Paul Ryan of Wisconsin puts forward a budget proposal that I think you consider serious and far-reaching. Have these events, let's put it this way, has the reaction to Barack Obama encouraged you about the state of the United States?
I've always believed that there have been pockets of sanity. But it is by no means a foregone conclusion that he will not be reelected next year.
Pockets of sanity is the best we can hope for?
Well, it's the best we've seen thus far now. I'm always happy to see some miracle, some knight in shining armor riding out of the wilderness.
Tom, one of the most, you write a lot about race and economic facts and fallacies, and we've gone through that in this discussion. And frankly, it's heartbreaking.
It is.
We think we've made progress,
Uh-huh.
and the reverse is true in many ways.
Yeah, we've
The
made
illegitimacy
progress.
rate-
We've made
Go ahead.
progress in some respects. We've had painful retrogressions. I think in terms of education, there's no question in my mind that kids who grew up where I grew up in Harlem don't get nearly the education that I got when I was growing up there.
Okay, so let me put this question to you with regard to race. John, you remember John Rawls and his famous veil of ignorance.
Oh, yes.
So let's just say that you're an African-American child about to be born.
Mm-hmm.
Do you choose 1930s America, the year in which you were born, or do you choose America in 2011?
I'm afraid that if you're not born in the South, you would choose in the 1930s.
You would.
In the 1940s, New York had one of the finest public education systems in the country. I came up from Charlotte, North Carolina, where kids from Charlotte.
How old were you when you came up?
9 years old.
Okay, so
Kids were routinely put back a year when they moved from Charlotte to New York. The latest information I have on education is that among the major cities in the country, Charlotte is now #1. New York is way down the list.
Segment 3, healthcare. Let me give you a quotation and a fact. The quotation comes from you in Basic Economics. Quote, "A long-standing staple of political rhetoric has been the attempt to keep the prices of medical care reasonable or affordable. Yet the amount of resources required to supply the things we want are wholly independent of what we are willing to pay. It is completely unreasonable to expect reasonable prices." That's the quotation. Here's the fact. The United States devotes 17% of its GDP to healthcare. The next country down in that is Switzerland at about 11% of its GDP. So we devote something like 50% more than the next country down. Now, surely it's not unreasonable to suggest that we're just spending too much.
The question is, when people are spending their own money, I don't know how third parties can say it's too much. Well, ironically, Rahm Emanuel's brother, who's a doctor, has on board for this whole Obamacare thing. But really, he revealed why Americans spend more. Americans don't, when they go to a hospital, they are in private or semi-private rooms more often than in countries on government health care. And so instead of being in a ward, you're in your own private or semi-private room. It costs more. American doctors are more readily available. There is less waiting time. Some people prefer to pay in money and other in waiting time. Now, when you have a painful disease and the government tells you there's a 6-month waiting list, that you're paying in a different way. It doesn't show up in the statistics, but you may not even live the 6 months, depending upon what you have.
So we pay more and get more.
That's it.
That's it. That's all there is to it.
That's it.
You don't want to say, but at the same time, our system is terribly inefficient in various ways.
No, it's not inefficient for people to buy what they want. It
has to be more complicated than that.
it's what's inefficient is having third parties decide what you need and don't need. As for example, in Sweden, where and it's not like an insurance company saying they won't pay for it. In Sweden, if they say that you don't need this, you can't pay for it with your own money because they control the whole system. And so your choice at that point is to leave Sweden, which if you're very sick may be a little hard to do, or to have what you need smuggled into you.
Right. Tom, in one of the last conversations I had with our friend Milton Friedman, I recall his saying he was musing about the future of healthcare, which, as you know, interested him for In fact, there are no new ideas, just proposals by Milton Friedman that haven't gotten around to being enacted yet, I sometimes feel. But Milton said, the situation we have in this country is untenable over the longer term. And he said, broadly speaking, about 50% of American healthcare is private, subject to the usual incentives of the private market. But about 50% with Medicare, Medicaid, and so forth, about 50% is effectively socialized, run through the government in one way or another. And Milton said, this is untenable. We will probably either go to a much more socialized system in which we will at least have the virtue of controlling prices. Quality may deteriorate, but prices might be controlled. Or we'll go in the other direction and push more of healthcare into the market, which would control prices and improve quality. Does that make sense to you, that analysis?
Yeah.
It's about 50-50, but it's untenable that we're at
I don't know why it's untenable. It's one of the few times I'm sure if he were here.
If he were here, of course he'd say I misstated it or.
Yeah. But when people want something, and when I was in the hospital last, I had a private room. No doubt that costs more than if I were in a ward.
Right.
Particularly as in Britain, where you can be ignored by the nurses. The women in Britain, one of the scandals is that they are having their babies in the hospitals, but not in the delivery room. I mean, they're having their babies in the hallway and the elevators because they're calling for the nurse, and the nurse will get around to it when she feels like it. And the baby is not going to wait.
Okay, let me ask you then a question about practical politics. One of the points you make in Basic Economics is that the government, politicians, face incentives the way ordinary actors in the free markets face incentives. Yes. So here's a question. It seems to me, as a layman watching things, that the people who are in favor of pushing more healthcare into the free market have been on the defensive for the last couple of years since President Obama was elected. Now we've had a change in the House of Election, and Republicans have come in, and they are saying we're going to fight this thing every step of the way.
I hope they do.
Well, it still feels defensive to me. We're going to hold up the money here, we're going to file a court challenge there, and it's a kind of a piecemeal attack. How can the terms of the debate be changed, if indeed they can, so that the argument for the market becomes dominant and unself-conscious and aggressive in a certain sense?
Well, that would require articulate Republicans.
All right, on to the next question. No. Well, are you encouraged when you look at the current Eric Cantor, these new people who've emerged in the House?
I must say, I saw Chris Christie, governor of New Jersey, for the first time. I thought, my gosh, an articulate Republican. When was the last time I saw one of those?
Articulate and also willing to fight.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. Tom, when you were writing your column, every so often you would publish a column in which you described your column as random thoughts on the passing scene. Last segment here, let's do a few random thoughts on the passing scene, all right? Listen to this list. The Thomas Sowell Reader, 2011. Intellectuals and Race, 2013. A new edition of your classic work, Basic Economics, in 2014. Wealth, Poverty, and Politics, 2015. And now, 2018, Discrimination and Disparities. And do you know what I just did? I just listed the books you've published since turning 80. Tom, you haven't had anything to prove to anybody for at least 3 decades. What keeps you at it? Why do you work so hard?
Well, I don't know.
I'm happy you do, you understand, but why do you?
Well, I don't work nearly as hard because I discontinued the column. I did that after spending some time in Yosemite with a couple of photo buddies, and I realized that in those 4 days we hadn't watched a single news program, we hadn't seen a single newspaper, I said, this is the life. I don't need to be watching, because most of the foolish things that are said on these programs were said 20 and 30 and 40 years ago and refuted 20 and 30 and 40 years ago.
By you, quite often.
By me, but by many other people. I see this thing about women get only X% of what men get for doing the same job. And there are studies, including studies done by women who have the courage to do these studies, more so than men do, showing that no, as you hold various things constant, this whatever that percentage is begins to shrink and shrink, and in some cases reverse. That among academic men and women, in the study that I did 40 years ago now, if you took never married women in academia, they had a higher income than never married men. And the data from not only from my studies, but a number of other studies show that the real difference is between women who are married and who become mothers and everybody else. That and men who get married have higher incomes than men who have same education, age, and so forth, who don't get married. And women who get married have lower than women who don't get married. And of course, this is because of the division of labor within the home.
Right.
And there's so many statistical mess-ups when they do these comparisons, I can't even get into them all.
But you're happier when you're not reading the news.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, you're also happier when you're working on a book.
Yes, when I can go out there and get the hard data and find out what's really happening.
Got it.
So what are some of the other federal policies or state, local policies that are meant to help minorities that you think actually have the opposite effect?
Well, one example is not. It's a local regulation. It's the licensing of many business and occupations. One that I talk about in my book and also on film here is the licensing of taxi cabs. I mean, that is, what does it take to become an owner-operator of a taxi? Well, you have to go out and buy a car, a used car. You have to maybe get some kind of insurance and some knowledge of the city and a driver's license. Well, you need much more than that today. That is, a poor, illiterate Italian in the 20s. In the 1920s, he just had to go out and buy a used car and write the word taxi on, and he was in business. Well, it turns out that in Philadelphia, you in order to own and operate one taxi, you have to go out and buy a license. They call it a medallion. And the license costs $400,000. In New York, the license to own and operate one taxi is $700,000. And a corporate license is over $1 million. These are for one taxi. And so you say, well, what is the effect of a law that generates that kind of license price? Well, it tends to discriminate against people getting into business who don't have $700,000 hanging around or the bank credit to be able to get a loan. And so it discriminates against people at the bottom of the ladder. And the reason why you have these licensing laws is that insiders want to have a license law so they can keep outsiders out and charge higher prices. And if you look at cities, like compare Washington, D.C. and New York, where the number of taxis in Washington, D.C. per 1,000 of population is much greater than New York. I think it's, when I did the study, it's like 12 taxis per 1,000 population. In New York is 2.4. The prices are cheaper. But however, people, and there's a movement in Washington to get taxis licensed here, and particularly the big companies.
Right. So nobody takes taxis anymore. Everybody uses Uber.
Right.
So what do you think of that kind of, this new kind of disruptive technology where these new, now anybody can just, become an employee of Uber and they don't have to get a taxi medallion, and they can go out and drive a cab. It might be a kid who's in graduate school or something wants to make. Is that something you think? That's
wonderful.
People would say, well, but you know what? I mean, it's interesting because when I first came here, most of the taxi cab drivers were black. Now they're, 24-year-old, white kids or senior citizens. And so this, some advocates of the minorities say, look at what this is doing. This is driving blacks out of this industry.
Well, I think one of the very, very important things is that you have to decide what is a racial issue and what is not a racial issue. Now, that is people who are sellers, they love a monopoly because the monopoly gives them an opportunity to charge higher prices. Now, you'll love a monopoly in what you sell, whether you're black or white. And so if you go to New York and you start saying, well, let's get rid of licensing of taxis, well, the black driver is going to be against you too. Because, everybody likes a monopoly. People like a monopoly in what they sell and competition in what they buy.
Now, why would a group of liberal intellectuals or politicians or media stars or whatever, why would they sit around and decide to dismember or dilute the criminal justice system if they thought in advance that it would raise the amount of criminality?
Oh, they didn't think that. But the point is,
they just thought wrongly that it would help.
Yes, but it would also give them an enormously larger role than they had before. I mean, a judge who just sits there and applies the laws that have been passed by the legislature has a very minor role. But if he takes the expansive judicial activist role, then of course he's on the leading edge, and he can look for the hosannas and all the rest of it from the sideline.
How does this play out in the realm of something else you have written about, which is affirmative action?
Exactly.
How does that process? What's the 1, 2, 3, 4 on that?
I haven't worked it out like that, but certainly there is no interest whatever in finding out empirically whether things have been made better or worse for minorities as a result of this program. And in fact, if you bring them up evidence, they'll say, but things would have been even worse had we not done this. Similarly with the war on poverty, you can show how dependency on government was going down, poverty was going down before this program was ever put in. And within a few years, dependence on government was going up, and after a few more years, the absolute number of people in poverty was going up.
Yeah, I read that in your book, but the absolute number of poverty is not the data. The relevant data would be the rate of poverty. And the rate of poverty, in fact, in the 1970s, I worked for President Johnson, so we have to establish there. So I mean, the line we took was that during the 1960s, during the Kennedy-Johnson administration, poverty did in fact go down sharply. And then the rate since then, not the absolute number because the country has grown larger, the rate has sort of bounced around at about flat, somewhere between 12 and 15%.
Yes, but don't forget, this was sold to the country, not on the grounds that if you transferred money from A to B, that B would have more money. That was not the argument. The argument was that dependency would be reduced, that you would, quote, invest in people, as Bill Clinton is now saying, now that people have forgotten what was said in the 60s. This will then, you give them job training and all those kinds of things, parenting skills, the whole bit. And this will then be an investment that will pay off in the future because there'll be fewer people dependent upon the government than there were before. And I go through a great number of people from John F. Kennedy to Lyndon Johnson, the New York Times, again, all the usual suspects. Said all these things.
Lyndon Johnson was not a usual suspect, Tom.
Well, he was the primary suspect. All right. But the fact is that was never tested. And when there were all these wonderful retrospectives held down in Texas and other places about this, the first order of business is to evade the criterion that they themselves set up when they set this out. And so no matter what happens, if it's a failure by the original criterion, then we just find another criterion by which it will be a success.
All right. Wall Street Journal, December 8th, quote, "In accepting the deal to cut payroll and business taxes and extend all of the Bush-era tax rates through 2012, as you and I speak, this hasn't been enacted in the Congress, but we're talking about the deal that President Obama cut with Republicans. To continue the quotation, Mr. Obama has implicitly admitted that his economic strategy has flopped. He is acknowledging that tax rates matter to growth, that treating business like robber barons has hurt investment and hiring, and that tax cuts are superior to spending as stimulus." Close quote. You buy every word of that?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Well, but what is painful to me, really, looking back, this argument is not a new argument. This argument was made in the 1920s. People were saying the same thing on both sides they're saying right now. The difference is that 75 years have elapsed, and there have been 4 administrations of both parties that have reduced high income tax rates every single time.
Name them.
The Coolidge, Kennedy, Reagan, and George W. Bush.
Right.
Every single time, the reduction in the tax rates has led to an increase in tax revenue. So I hear people on television saying how the government can't afford to give this tax cuts to the rich. You know, they're not giving anything to anybody.
Right. Here's a question about Ricochet contributor Steve Manasek, quote, "It's as close to dogma as there is among conservatives that cutting taxes, particularly marginal rates, spurs economic growth. But Bill Clinton raised taxes, including marginal rates, and the economy boomed. Do tax rates really matter to economic growth? And if they do, how do you explain the Clinton expansion?"
I haven't looked at the Clinton expansion, but I know that the Clinton, quote, surplus taxes those laws are passed in Congress. All spending and taxing bills originate in the House of Representatives. Right. And when the House of Representatives is in the hands of the opposite party, I don't know how any president can take any credit for whether there's a surplus or not.
Okay. Milton Friedman defined a surplus as when the money comes in so fast that even Congress can't spend it.
That's true.
You had mentioned the fact that people don't really follow or have reverence for the Constitution anymore. And I certainly agree with that. But why is it that you and all the other conservative and libertarian commentaries don't talk about what is the purpose of a Constitution? I'm an attorney, or I was an attorney, and I can tell you that very few attorneys really understand what the function of a Constitution. And all I hear from you and others is, well, we just don't respect the Constitution anymore, but there's very little about explaining why a Constitution is so important.
Could I try?
Is that a challenge?
Good. Well, I think that the Constitution represents our rules of the game. And it represents the relationship that we have between American and Americans and government. You'll hear some attorneys say, well, a narrow interpretation of the Constitution is wrong because the Constitution is a living document. And anyone who says that the Constitution is a living document is also saying that we do not have a Constitution, because for the rules of the game to mean anything, they have to be fixed. Or another way to put it is to ask you, how many of you would like to play me poker tonight and the rules be living? You know, maybe my two pair under certain circumstances can beat your three of the kind, you know. Now, the founders, in their wisdom, they gave us Article 5 because as a means to amend the United States Constitution, because they recognized that some changes might have to be made. But again, I think that the purpose of the Constitution is to lay out the rules of the game, and also the purpose of the Constitution is to limit what the government can do. To limit the power of Congress. I mean, if you read through the Constitution, there are about 40 restrictions on Congress. Or if you look just at the Bill of Rights, I mean, the Bill of Rights, the language of the Bill of Rights says, Congress shall not infringe, Congress shall not disparage, Congress shall not prohibit. I mean, all this distrust for Congress, because the founders knew that government was the enemy of mankind.
Well, okay,
but we need some government.
Challenge you on this.
And I ask you, and I point out that when we die, and if at our next destination we see anything like the Bill of Rights, we know that we're in hell, because a Bill of Rights in heaven would be an insult to God. I mean, that you cannot trust God.
But look, I mean, the Constitution basically allowed slavery. It basically said a black man is worth 3/5 of what a white man is. It did not allow women to vote. I mean, so a lot of people on the left who don't agree with you, they say, well, this is a racial document that disparages the rights of people that it's supposed to protect.
Well, first of all, my God, I am thankful for that compromise that made blacks count for 3/5 of a vote. And the reason why is that the slaveholding states wanted their slaves to count for one vote. And if they counted for one vote, it would give the slaveholding states more power in Congress. And so that's why there was this, and matter of fact, the Constitutional Convention could have gone down the tubes, but there's this compromise where they said, well, it's 3/5. And then the Constitution worked on the abolition of slave trade. Now, first of all, I would say that you're never going to find a perfect set of rules in the game until we get to heaven. And so, but if you say, what are the real choices here on earth? You're not going to come up with much better than the United States Constitution. It was not a perfect document. But it's more perfect than anything else, anywhere else. And it was perfect enough to have people from all the world want to come to the United States, flee to the United States. And I think that's a very good...
They still want to come.
But however, the sad thing is that many people are leaving. Businesses and others are leaving. And I think Americans ought to be concerned about why some people are leaving and taking their money with them.
Thank you. This has been incredible. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
A lot of people think that it's too late to turn back and reverse things. And I wonder, like, for example, people say, oh, we're getting near a tipping point where so many people are dependent on government that there's no turning back. I mean, are you a pessimist or an optimist on, is it too late to turn things around?
Well, I have a very good friend and colleague, longtime friend and colleague, Thomas Sowell. When we talk on the phone, he said, Walter, the only thing good about being our age is when the stuff really hits the fan. We'll be gone. Now,
that's pretty pessimistic.
No, but however, I think that if there's an optimistic note, is that American people have never done the wrong thing for the long time. We always managed to get our house act together. But we are close to the point that we don't have much time to get our act together. I think that we need to have extensive cuts in spending. And I think that the only way politically you can do it is to have something like a meat axe approach, something like a 10% across the board, because people who are beneficiaries of various programs, then they'll rally politically against you. But I don't see Americans supporting that until there's some catastrophe in our country. Maybe they will. But I could be absolutely wrong, and I hope I'm wrong. But so, my daughter and her recently got married a couple of years ago, and they were asking me some recommendations for the future. And so I said, well, you ought to try to save and hide in your own property about $40,000 or $50,000 in gold coin, and not as an investment, but as a way to get out of our country. They said, well, where do you go? Well, so I said, well, New Zealand, Australia. And I said, but where to go is not a very important question when things get bad, just anywhere other than. So things can get rough. And history shows that in other great civilizations of the past. And so again, this question, are we any different?
Segment 3, race and culture, economic facts and fallacies. A fallacy is that the current fatherless families so prevalent among contemporary blacks are a legacy of slavery, where families were not recognized under slavery. This ignores the fact that the problem has become much worse among generations of blacks far removed from slavery than among generations closer to the era of slavery, close quote. Explain that.
You mean explain why it is so? Or
yes, why is that? What on earth is going on there? That is so counter to what we assume.
Well, first of all, most people have not recognized the fact that if you go back into the 20s, you find that married couple families were much more prevalent among blacks then than today. You find also, incidentally, that the blacks were had as late as 1930, blacks had lower unemployment rates than whites. So all these things that we complain about and attribute to the era of slavery, those things should have been worse in the past than in the present.
Right.
But in fact, they're worse in the present than in the past. And I think if you want to look for a turning point, it would be since the 1960s.
And what happened in the 1960s?
Oh, you began to have not only the welfare state, you began to have the mindset that goes with the welfare state, so that there was no stigma any longer attached, for example, to being on relief or welfare.
And so, but why? Well, illegitimacy is exploding now among, it's high among Hispanics,
Yes.
and it's exploding among whites. But the Moynihan report, when was that, Tom?
Oh, in the 60s. 64, 65.
When Moynihan talked about the illegitimacy rate among
Yes.
blacks, which was exploding then. So what if the welfare state changes the way Americans think?
Yes.
Why did black Americans prove susceptible to that change first?
Because they were poor. I don't think that many Asian American girls who are preparing to go off to Stanford or Harvard are going to say, hey, I can live on welfare, why should I abstain?
So it's nothing to do with slavery, or at least it's less to do with slavery than it is to do with what with what we have willfully constructed since. Response to the crisis: the Federal Reserve floods the financial markets with liquidity, while first the Bush administration and then the Obama administration enact stimulus and bailout packages that now amount to, as best I can make it out, something like $3.6 trillion. Correct responses to the crisis? Did the government do the right thing?
No. Those are easy questions.
All right.
One of the painful things, I mean, you can call anything you want to call it. You can call it a stimulus. All the data indicated it didn't stimulate anything except boondoggles across the country as politicians handed out money to all the special interests that they are interested in pleasing. But for example, when they dumped all this money in the banks, the idea was the banks would then pass that money on and more lending.
Right.
Lending went down. They dumped all this money into the businesses. The businesses reduced their investment. All kinds of money is piling up. There's record amounts of money piling up.
What about GM? Surely that's the one success story. Workers are still employed. GM is now a competitive company again. They're paying back billions to the American taxpayer.
Oh, this is the famous one where we guaranteed them and it didn't cost the taxpayers a dime.
Right.
Yes. It's like going to Las Vegas, and saying, I put my quarter in the machine and out came $100. Yes. Now put another quarter and see if you get another 100.
All right.
And put $1 million in there and see if you get $1 million back. We had the same thing with the savings and loan crisis a couple of decades ago. They said, we're back in the savings and loan industry, we're guaranteeing it, but it's not costing the taxpayers anything. Well, it's not until it fails, and then it costs the taxpayers.
All right. Segment 2, what is to be done now? Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke announced this past autumn that the Federal Reserve would engage in a new round of, quote, I'm using his term, quantitative easing, the so-called QE2. The Fed will purchase, Tom, wipe that smile off your face. This is serious. The Fed will purchase some $600 billion of Treasury instruments to keep interest rates low and spur economic growth. That's Ben Bernanke. On the other hand, we have our colleagues at the Hoover Institution, John Taylor, Mike Boskin, and John Kogan, signing an open letter to Ben Bernanke, which read in part, quote, we believe the large-scale asset purchase plan should be discontinued. The planned asset purchases risk currency debasement and inflation, and we do not think they will achieve the Fed's objective of promoting employment, close quote. Whose side is Tom Sowell on?
Oh, I'm on the side that people say they shouldn't have done it.
Easy, another easy one.
Oh my gosh, yes. There used to be a phrase for this, it was called monetizing the debt. It means that the Treasury Department has deficit spending, so they put out all these bonds that they're selling, and if the public won't buy them, the Federal Reserve will buy them because the Federal Reserve can legally print its own money. So it's no problem for the Federal Reserve to buy them. It's just that's what that amounts to is one, inflation, and two, it amounts to a hidden tax, which will not be confined to the rich, as they call it. I mean, in other words, if you've got X thousands of dollars in your bank account and the Federal Reserve starts printing more money, it is simply stealing the value of the money that you've put aside. So that's the same thing as a tax, only it's an inflation tax.
Let me read you something that Speaker Gingrich wrote in his book, To Renew America. He said, since 1965, there has been a calculated effort by cultural elites to discredit this civilization and replace it with a culture of irresponsibility that is incompatible with American freedoms as we have known them. Do you buy that? Is that basically what you're saying?
Yes, although I would limit that to those who are sort of at the top of this kind of thing. Because further down, the people believe things because so many others believe them, because they're in the air and so on.
But, you know, I was particularly interested in what he said was that it is a calculated effort. This now, do you believe that the people, the anointed, as you call them, are sitting around in a conspiratorial mode, calculating, as Newt Gingrich says, and saying, here's what we're going to do? Or do you just think they're wrong and this is what they believe and they have this certain arrogance about it? Because it's two very different ideas.
This is why I made the distinction between the leaders and the others. I mean, I think that when people say things like, more American wives are battered on Super Bowl Sunday, you see, than any other time of the year, and there's not a speck of evidence for that. That is calculated, because there is no data that could even be misinterpreted that way. In other words, because there is no data, period. And so, yes, but I think that 99% of the people who believe it are not calculating. And I think one of the reasons that it flies without even being challenged for evidence is that there is a certain vision of how the world is, and in that world, men are oppressing women. And therefore, when you say something like this, it fits the vision, and that's the end of it. There's no demand for evidence.
You have in your book sort of a series toward the beginning of how the actual process works of forming one of these ideas and selling it and rejecting the proof. Maybe you could just kind of march it through this as a model of it.
All right, there's a 4-stage pattern. And in the first stage is what I call the crisis. And so we're hyped to believe that something is a terrible crisis for which something must be done. What was fascinating to me in doing the research for the book is that very often the thing that's said to be in crisis has often been getting better for years on end. But that gets ignored. Then the second stage is...
For example, infant mortality, to use one of the...
Well, I'm thinking about teenage pregnancy and venereal disease. Those things were getting better